Commander Zethral had seen war for 300 years. He was old, even by the standards of his people, the Volanti. His skin had turned from bright blue to a dull gray, and his 4 eyes had grown tired from watching so many battles. He had written books about war. He had taught young officers how to fight. He believed he had seen everything the galaxy could show him. He was wrong. The humans were new to space. They had only learned to travel between stars 80 years ago. To the Volanti, 80 years was nothing. The Volanti had been flying through space for 12,000 years. The Kreth, their enemies, had been doing it for 6,000. Humans were babies, children who had just learned to walk. When the Grand Council told Zethral to go and watch the humans fight, he almost laughed. What could these newcomers possibly show him? They had small ships, old weapons, and no experience. The Kreth would crush them in days, maybe hours, but the Council wanted a report. They wanted to know if humans were worth saving, or if they should be left to die. So Zethral packed his things and traveled to the contested rim, where humans had built their first military outpost. The human ship was called the Relentless Dawn. It was ugly by Volanti standards. The metal was rough and unpolished. The corridors were narrow and smelled strange. Everything felt temporary, like the humans had built it in a hurry and never bothered to make it beautiful. The captain was a woman named Laura Simmons. She was small by human standards, with brown hair that she kept tied behind her head and eyes that looked like they had not slept in a very long time. When Zethral first met her, she was drinking something black and bitter from a metal cup. "Commander Zethral," she said, not standing up from her chair. "Welcome aboard. Sorry about the mess. We weren't expecting company." Zethral looked around her office. There were papers everywhere. A jacket hung over a chair. A plant sat dying in the corner. "Your quarters are disorganized," he observed. "Yeah." She took another drink. "That's kind of our thing." Over the next few days, Zethral walked through the ship and watched the humans work. What he saw confused him. On Volanti ships, everything was order and silence. Officers spoke only when needed. Ranks were respected absolutely. No one would ever dare to question a superior. But on the Relentless Dawn, everything was noise and chaos. Crew members argued with each other in the hallways. They played games during their rest hours, shouting and laughing like children. They called Captain Simmons by her first name when they were not on duty. They touched each other constantly, slapping shoulders and shaking hands. "You do not enforce discipline," Zethral said to Captain Simmons one evening. She shrugged. "Depends on what you mean by discipline. Order, hierarchy, respect for authority. My crew respects me fine. They just don't fear me." She set down her cup. "Fear makes people follow orders, but it doesn't make them think. And in a fight, I need people who can think. What if they refuse an order? Then maybe my order was wrong." She smiled at his shocked expression. "Look, Commander, I know how your people do things. Top-down control. Every action planned in advance. Every soldier a piece on a game board. That works great when everything goes according to plan. But what happens when the plan falls apart?" Zethral did not have an answer. On his 7th day aboard the ship, he met Danny Reyes. Danny was the tactical officer, responsible for weapons and combat planning. He was young, only 23 years old. In Volanti terms, he was barely more than a newborn. "You're the alien historian, right?" Danny asked, shaking Zethral's hand with too much enthusiasm. "That's so cool. I have so many questions. Have you really been alive for 300 years? What's the craziest battle you've ever seen? Do Volanti dream?" Zethral did not know how to respond to such direct questioning. "I am here to observe, not to be observed." Right, sorry." Danny grinned. It's just exciting to meet someone from another species. We haven't had much contact with aliens who aren't trying to kill us. The Kreth. Danny's smile faded. Yeah, the Kreth. The Kreth were an old species, older than the Volanti. They had built an empire across half the galaxy by conquering anyone who stood in their way. They did not negotiate. They did not make treaties. They simply took what they wanted and destroyed anyone who resisted. When humans had arrived in the contested rim, the Kreth had given them a simple choice: leave or die. The humans had refused to leave. Why? Zethral asked Danny. Your species is young. You could have found another region of space. Why fight a war you cannot win? Danny thought about it for a moment. Because they told us we couldn't stay. And humans don't like being told what we can't do. That is not a logical reason. No, Danny agreed. It's a human reason. On the 19th day, the Kreth attacked. Zethral was on the bridge when the alarm started screaming. He watched the crew snap into action, moving to their stations with a speed that surprised him. Captain Simmons walked calmly to her chair and sat down. Report, she said. 23 Kreth warships, Danny announced. Dropping out of hyperspace at Grid 7. They're forming up in a standard attack pattern. 23 ships. The humans had only 3 carriers and a handful of smaller vessels. By any reasonable calculation, they were already dead. Zethral expected panic. He expected fear. He expected Captain Simmons to order a retreat, to run away and live to fight another day. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and looked at her crew. They looked back at her. Something passed between them, something Zethral did not understand. A communication without words. Well, Captain Simmons said, I guess we should say hello. The crew laughed. Actually laughed. They were about to face impossible odds, and they were laughing. Maria Santos, the chief engineer, called up from the engine room. Engines are hot and ready, Captain. Let's give these bastards a show. Katie Marsh, a young pilot who could not have been older than 20, was already running toward the fighter bay. First 1 to 10 kills buys drinks. Captain Simmons looked at Zethral. Her tired eyes held something he had never seen before. Not fear, not courage. Something else. Something that made the scales on the back of his neck stand up. You wanted to see how humans fight, she said. Pay attention. You might learn something. The relentless dawn turned toward the enemy fleet, and Zethral began to understand that everything he knew about war was about to change. The Kreth fleet moved like a single creature. 23 ships flying in perfect formation, each one knowing exactly where to go and what to do. Their hulls were black and covered with sharp angles, designed to look frightening. It worked. Even Zethral, who had seen hundreds of battles, felt a chill run through his old bones. The mathematics of war were simple. More ships meant more guns. More guns meant more damage. More damage meant victory. The Kreth had 7 times as many ships as the humans. By every calculation Zethral could make, this battle would last less than an hour. The humans would be dust floating in space. Danny Reyes pulled up the enemy formation on the main display screen. His broken arm was wrapped in a temporary cast, but his fingers moved across the controls without hesitation. Standard envelopment pattern, he announced. They're trying to surround us and hit us from all sides at once. They're not even trying to be creative, Maria Santos said from the engine room, her voice coming through the speakers. The Kreth have been using that same tactic for 600 years. Captain Simmons studied the display. Her face was calm, like she was looking at a puzzle instead of her own death. That's because it works. Why change something that works? Because someone might figure out how to beat it, Danny said. Exactly. The captain smiled. Let's figure it out. What happened next was something Zethral would never forget. He had studied military tactics for 3 centuries. He knew every formation, every strategy, every trick that civilized species had developed. But he had never seen anything like this. Captain Simmons did not give orders the way Volante commanders did. She did not tell each ship exactly where to go and what to do. Instead, she spoke in short phrases that made no sense to Zethral, but seemed to mean everything to her crew. "Danny, remember that game we played last month? The one with the asteroids? Yeah, let's do that. On it." And suddenly, the human ships were moving. Not in formation. Not in any pattern Zethro recognized. They scattered like insects, each one flying in a different direction. It looked like chaos. It looked like panic, but it was not. The Kreth formation was built to attack enemies who fought in straight lines. Their guns were aimed at the center, where enemy ships were supposed to be. When the humans scattered, the Kreth had to break their own formation to chase them. And the moment they broke formation, they stopped being a single creature. They became 23 separate ships, each one hunting on its own. The humans started picking them off one by one. Katie Marsh was the first pilot to score a kill. Her fighter was tiny compared to the Kreth destroyers, barely bigger than a shuttle. But she flew it like it was part of her body, spinning and diving through space with impossible grace. She found a gap between 2 Kreth ships. Both ships were trying to turn, trying to aim at her, but they were too slow. They were built for power, not speed. Katie flew straight between them, so close that Zethral could see the lights of their windows flashing past. Then she did something insane. She ejected from her fighter. Zethral watched as the tiny escape pod shot away from the ship. A moment later, the fighter's reactor core exploded. The blast was enormous, right enough to blind the cameras for a second. When the light faded, both Kreth destroyers were torn apart, their hulls ripped open like paper. "Recovery team, pick up Katie," Captain Simmons said calmly. "Katie, that was very stupid. It worked, didn't it?" Katie's voice was laughing through the radio. "Don't do it again. No promises, ma'am." Zethral stared at the screen. She destroyed her own ship. She could have died. "She calculated the risk," Danny said, without looking away from his controls. "She knew she could eject in time. How could she possibly know that?" Danny shrugged. "She's good at math." The battle went on for 3 hours. 3 hours of chaos and fire and death. Zethral watched humans do things that should have been impossible. He saw a damaged carrier use itself as a shield to protect the smaller ship. He saw pilots fly into enemy hangars and fight hand-to-hand against Kreth soldiers. He saw engineers repair critical systems while the ship burned around them. But what shocked him most was how they talked to each other. There was no fear in their voices. No panic. They joked with each other. They laughed at death. When one ship was destroyed, there was a moment of silence, and then someone would say something like, "They owed me 20 credits," and everyone would laugh again. It was not that they did not care. Zethral could see the pain in their eyes every time a friend died. But they did not let the pain stop them. They put it somewhere deep inside and kept fighting. By the time the battle ended, the humans had lost 4 ships. 4 ships out of their tiny fleet. It was a terrible loss. But the Kreth had lost 17 ships. Against an enemy they should have crushed in minutes. When the last Kreth ship retreated into hyperspace, the bridge of the relentless dawn was silent. Not the silence of shock or grief, but the silence of exhaustion. Every person on that bridge had been awake for over 20 hours, fighting and thinking and refusing to die. Captain Simmons leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. "Get some rest, everyone," she said quietly. "They'll be back." Danny started to stand, then stopped. He looked at Zethral. "You're shaking," he said. Zethral looked down at his hands. Danny was right. His 4 hands were trembling, and he could not make them stop. "I have seen war for 300 years, Zethral said slowly. "I have watched species rise and fall. I have recorded the deaths of billions. But I have never seen anything like this." "Like what?" Zethral struggled to find the words. "Your people should have lost. The numbers were clear. There was no logical path to victory. But you did not fight with logic. You fought with something else. Something I do not have a word for." Danny thought about it for a moment. "Spite," he said finally. "Spite?" "Yeah. The universe said we were supposed to die. And we said no." Danny grinned, even though his face was pale with exhaustion and pain. Humans are really good at saying no. He walked off the bridge, leaving Zethral alone with his shaking hands and his broken understanding of war. That night, Zethral started writing his report. He wrote and deleted the first sentence 100 times. Nothing he wrote could capture what he had seen. No words in any language he knew could explain how a species so young, so small, so outmatched could refuse to accept defeat. In the end, he wrote one sentence and stopped. "I thought I knew war. I was wrong." It was not much of a report, but it was the only truth he had left. 3 days after the battle, Zethral asked Captain Simmons for permission to interview the crew. He needed to understand what he had seen. He needed answers that made sense. "Go ahead," she said, not looking up from her paperwork. "Just don't bother anyone who's sleeping. We haven't had much rest lately." Zethral found Maria Santos in the engine room. She was lying under a massive machine, only her legs visible, singing a strange song in a language he did not recognize. Sparks flew from somewhere above her, and the air smelled like burning metal. "Chief Santos," he said, "may I speak with you?" "Sure." She did not come out from under the machine. "Talk while I work. This power coupling won't fix itself." Zethral looked at the clock on the wall. It had been 40 hours since the battle ended. 40 hours since anyone on this ship should have slept. "How are you still awake?" he asked. Maria laughed. The sound echoed strangely in the metal room. "Coffee, lots of coffee, and pure stubbornness. Your species requires 8 hours of sleep per cycle. Without it, your brain begins to fail. Your body breaks down. This is basic biology." "Yeah, well, more sparks. More singing. Biology can wait. My ship needs me. You will collapse. Probably." She slid out from under the machine, her face covered in grease and sweat. Her eyes were red and her hands were shaking slightly, but she was smiling. "But not today. Today I've got work to do." "Why?" Zethral asked. "Why push yourself past your limits? Another engineer could take over. You could rest." Maria wiped her hands on her uniform. "Because these engines know me. I know every sound they make, every vibration, every little problem. If something goes wrong during the next fight, I'll feel it before the sensors catch it. And that might save lives. That is not logical." "No," she agreed. "It's personal." Zethral moved on to the medical bay, where he found Danny Reyes getting his broken arm properly treated. The young officer winced as the doctor worked, but he did not make a sound. "You fought for 3 hours with a broken arm," Zethral said. "The pain must have been significant." It was. Danny watched the doctor wrap fresh bandages around his arm. "Hurt like hell. Why did you not ask for relief? Another officer could have taken your position." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Because my station is weapons control. I know those systems better than anyone else on this ship. If I had left, someone else would have had to figure them out in the middle of a fight. People might have died because of the delay. So you accepted pain to protect others." "I accepted pain because it was the right thing to do." Danny flexed his fingers carefully. "Pain is just information, Commander. It tells you something is wrong, but it doesn't tell you what to do about it. You have to decide that for yourself. And you decided to keep fighting. I decided that my arm could wait. The people trying to kill us couldn't. In the mess hall, Zethral found Katie Marsh eating a meal of synthetic protein. The young pilot had bruises covering half her face from her escape pod ejection, and she was missing a tooth. But she ate with enthusiasm, like she was enjoying the best food in the galaxy. "Commander," she waved him over. "Sit down. Try this stuff. It tastes terrible, but it's got everything your body needs to rebuild itself." Zethral sat across from her, studying her damaged face. "You nearly died. Nearly is the important word there." She took another bite. "Nearly means I didn't. Does that not frighten you? The closeness of death?" Katie thought about it while she chewed. "Sure, death is scary. But being scared doesn't change anything. The Kreth were still out there. My friends were still fighting. I could be scared and hide, or I could be scared and do something useful. I chose useful. But why sacrifice yourself? You destroyed your own ship. You could have retreated and let those 2 destroyers kill someone else." Katie shook her head. "No, I saw an opportunity. I took it. That's what we do. We humans." She smiled, and with her missing tooth, it looked almost childish. "We're not the strongest species out there. We're not the smartest. We definitely don't live the longest. But we're really, really good at one thing. What is that? Not giving up." She pushed her tray aside and leaned forward. "Do you know how long humans have been fighting, Commander? Not in space. On our home planet. Just fighting each other." Zethral shook his head. 10,000 years. Maybe longer. We fought with rocks and sticks and swords and guns and bombs. We fought in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands. We fought wars that lasted decades. Wars that killed millions. And through all of it, through all that death and destruction, we never stopped. Never stopped fighting. Never stopped getting back up. Katie's eyes were bright, despite her injuries. Every time we got knocked down, we stood up again. Every time someone said we couldn't win, we found a way. That's who we are. That's what we do. We endure." Zethral sat in silence for a long moment. He thought about the species he had watched over 3 centuries. The Volanthi, with their perfect order and ancient wisdom. The Kreth, with their overwhelming power and cruel efficiency. Dozens of others, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. None of them had this. None of them had spent thousands of years learning how to survive against impossible odds. None of them had built their entire civilization on the simple refusal to stay down. "You are a very strange species," he said finally. Katie laughed. "Yeah, we get that a lot." That night, Zethral walked through the corridors of the relentless dawn. The ship was quiet now, most of the crew finally sleeping. But even in sleep, they showed their nature. He saw crew members curled up in corners, using jackets as blankets because they had not made it to their beds before exhaustion took them. He saw repair teams who had fallen asleep at their stations, tools still in their hands. They had given everything they had. And Zethral knew with absolute certainty that when they woke up, they would give everything again. He stopped at a window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Kreth were regrouping. They would come back. They always came back. And when they did, these strange, stubborn, impossible humans would be waiting for them. Zethral had spent 300 years studying war. He had written books about tactics and strategy and the mathematics of victory. But none of his books had ever mentioned the one thing that mattered most, the will to keep going when logic said to stop. He began writing notes for a new report. Not about tactics or weapons or ship formations. About something far more dangerous. About a species that had turned suffering into strength. That had learned to carry impossible weights because giving up was simply not in their nature. The Grand Council needed to know. Not that humans could fight. Anyone could fight. The Council needed to know that humans could endure, and that made them more dangerous than any species Zethral had ever seen. 1 month after the first battle, Captain Larver Simmons invited Zethral to her quarters. She had never done this before. Their conversations had always been brief, professional, held on the bridge or in the corridors between duties. Her room was small and cluttered, like everything else on the human ship. Books made of actual paper sat in piles on the floor. Photographs hung on the walls, showing faces Zethral did not recognize. A plant, slightly less dead than the one in her office, sat on the windowsill. "Sit down," she said, pointing to a chair. "I want to show you something." She opened a drawer in her desk and took out a bottle filled with amber liquid. The glass was old and scratched, with a handwritten label that Zethral could not read. "Whiskey," she explained, pouring 2 glasses. "My grandfather made it. He died 20 years ago, before any of this started. But he always told me to save it for when I really needed it." Zethral accepted the glass but did not drink. "Is now such a time?" "Maybe." She sat down across from him and took a long sip. Her face changed slightly, softening in a way he had not seen before. "You've been watching us for a month now, Commander. Writing your reports. Trying to understand us. I thought it was time we actually talked. Talked about what? About why we are the way we are." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. For a moment she was silent, and Zethral could see the weight she carried in the way her shoulders curved forward. "Do you know how old humanity is?" she asked. "Your species achieved intelligent civilization approximately 10,000 years ago. And do you know how much of that time we spent at war?" Zethral had researched this. The answer had shocked him. "Nearly all of it. Nearly all of it." She turned back to face him. 10,000 years of fighting. Not against aliens. Not against other species. Against ourselves. We invented new weapons just so we could kill each other better. We burned cities. We destroyed civilizations. We came close to ending our entire species at least twice. This is known. The Grand Council considers it a sign of primitive development. Captain Simmons laughed, but there was no humor in it. Primitive. Yes, that's one word for it. But let me tell you what else it means. She sat back down and poured herself another drink. It means that every human alive today is descended from survivors. People who lived through wars and plagues and famines and disasters. People who refused to die when death was the easy option. For 10,000 years, the weak were killed and the strong survived. And the strong taught their children how to be strong. And those children taught their children. Generation after generation, learning the same lesson over and over. What lesson? That the universe is trying to kill you. And the only way to survive is to be too stubborn to die. Zethral thought about this. The Volanthi had been spacefaring for 12,000 years, but they had never faced extinction. They had grown in peace, expanding slowly across the stars, never truly tested. The Kreth were similar. They had conquered weak species, but they had never met an enemy that could truly threaten them. "You are saying that human strength comes from human suffering," he said. Slowly, "I'm saying that we've been training for this moment for 10,000 years." Captain Simmons met his eyes. "Every war we fought taught us something. Every disaster we survived made us harder. Every time we thought we couldn't take any more, we found out we were wrong. We could always take more. We could always keep going. But the Kreth have more ships, more weapons, more resources. Mathematics does not favor emotion. No, but mathematics doesn't account for everything." She leaned forward. "The Kreth have never lost." "Not really. They've conquered species who couldn't fight back. They've crushed enemies who gave up when the odds turned against them. But they've never faced someone who kept fighting after they should have been dead. Like humans. Like humans. Like humans. She smiled, and for a moment she looked very young. The Kreth think war is about numbers. Ships and guns and soldiers. They calculate victory like a math problem. But that's not what war is. War is about will. About who wants to win badly enough to pay the price. And humans have been paying that price for longer than the Kreth have existed. She stood up again and took one of the photographs from the wall. It showed a young man in an old military uniform, standing in front of a damaged building. "My great-great-grandfather," she said. "He fought in a war on Earth over 200 years ago. His side was losing. They were surrounded, outnumbered, running out of food and ammunition. Everyone expected them to surrender. What happened? They didn't." She put the photograph back. "They held on for 3 more months. Most of them died. But they held on long enough for help to arrive. And when the war was over, their side won. Why did they not surrender? Surely survival was more valuable than pride." Captain Simmons shook her head. It wasn't about pride. It was about the people behind them. The families who would be killed if they stopped fighting. The future that would be destroyed if they gave up. They didn't fight for victory. They fought for time. For the chance that someone somewhere would survive because they refused to quit. Zethral looked at the photograph. The young man's face was tired and dirty, but his eyes were bright. He looked like someone who knew he might die, but had decided to keep going anyway. "The Kreth will send more ships," Zethral said. "Hundreds of ships. Perhaps thousands. Eventually, mathematics will win. Maybe." Captain Simmons finished her drink. "But here's the thing about humans, Commander. We don't fight because we think we'll win. We fight because fighting is all we know how to do. Because somewhere in our blood, in our bones, in our very nature, there's a voice that says giving up is worse than death." She met his eyes, and Zethral saw something in her gaze that he had never seen in 300 years of watching war. Not courage, not determination, something older, something that had been passed down through 10,000 years of survival. A fire that could not be put out because it had never been allowed to die. "The Kreth think they know war," she said quietly. "But they've never met a species that's been fighting since before they learned to make fire. They've never met someone who spent their entire existence learning how to survive the unsurvivable." She poured one more drink and held it up. "They will learn," she said. "And we will teach them." Zethral finally raised his glass and drank. The liquid burned his throat, but he did not look away from her eyes. In that moment, he understood something that all his books and all his studies had never taught him. The Kreth were not fighting a species. They were fighting 10,000 years of evolution, designed for exactly this moment. And for the first time in 3 centuries, Zethral felt something he had almost forgotten. Fear, not of the humans, but of what they were capable of becoming when the universe finally pushed them far enough. He was afraid of what would happen when humanity was truly unbound. The final battle came 6 months after Zethral first stepped onto the relentless dawn. He had sent dozens of reports to the Grand Council during that time, trying to explain what he had witnessed. They had dismissed most of them. Exaggeration, they said. Emotional bias. A 300-year-old historian losing his objectivity. They stopped dismissing him when the Kreth sent their full fleet. 400 warships dropped out of hyperspace above the human colony world of New Haven. 400 ships against humanity's 63. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The Kreth were done playing with these strange new creatures. They had come to end the human problem forever. Zephyr stood on the bridge of the Relentless Dawn and watched the enemy fleet fill the screens. Beside him, Captain Laura Simmons looked at the display with calm eyes. "Well," she said softly, "there they are." Danny Reyes ran the numbers on his console. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. "If we fight, we lose. The math is clear. The math is always clear." Captain Simmons pressed a button on her chair. "All ships. All crews. This is your captain speaking." Her voice echoed through every human vessel in the fleet. In the engine room, Maria Santos stopped working and listened. In the fighter bay, Katie Marsh paused with her helmet in her hands. Across 63 ships, thousands of humans stopped what they were doing and waited to hear what their leader would say. "I won't lie to you," Simmons said. "Most of us won't survive this. The numbers are against us. They have always been against us. From the moment humanity reached the stars, we have been outnumbered, outgunned, and underestimated." She paused, looking around the bridge at her crew. At Danny, who had fought with a broken arm. At the ensigns who had never seen combat before this war. At Zethral, who had come to study them and stayed to witness something impossible. But numbers have never told the whole story of who we are. We are here because our ancestors survived things that should have killed them. Ice ages that froze the world. Plagues that killed half of everyone alive. Wars that burned cities to ash. Every single one of you is descended from people who refused to die when death was the easy choice. Her voice grew stronger, filling the silence between the stars. The Kreth think this is about ships and weapons. They don't understand that humanity has never fought for things. We fight for each other, for the person standing next to us, for the ones waiting at home, for the chance that someone somewhere might live free because we were too stubborn to quit. She stood up from her chair. Today, we show the galaxy what humanity is capable of. Not because we want to, not because we think we'll win, but because when the universe tells us to lie down and die, we have only one answer. She looked directly at the camera broadcasting to the fleet. No, the human ships began to move. 63 vessels, tiny against the darkness, flying toward 400 enemies. It looked like suicide. It was suicide, but they flew anyway. The battle lasted 11 hours. Zethral recorded everything. His instruments captured data that would change the way the galaxy understood humans forever. He watched Maria Santos keep the engines running for 6 hours after they should have failed. Her hands burned and bleeding from repairs made without protective gear. He watched Danny Reyes coordinate weapons fire across 30 ships simultaneously. His broken arm rebroken during an explosion that killed 3 people beside him. He watched Katie Marsh lead fighter squadrons into the heart of the Kreth formation, losing half her pilots but destroying twice as many enemy ships. He watched humans do things that violated every biological limit he knew. Wounded soldiers dragged themselves to stations because no one else was left to fill them. Crews fought with failing life support, breathing thin air that should have made them pass out. Pilots rammed enemy vessels when their weapons failed, ejecting at the last second or not ejecting at all. He watched humans die. So many humans died, but every death bought time. Every sacrifice created an opening. Every act of impossible courage weakened the enemy just a little bit more. And through it all, they smiled, not because they were winning. They were not winning. They were dying. But they smiled anyway, because that was who they were. That was what 10,000 years of evolution had created. A species that could laugh at death because they had been facing it since before they learned to write. When the last Kreth flagship finally broke apart, there were only 31 human ships left. 31 out of 63. Nearly half the fleet was gone, turned to debris floating in the void. But the Kreth Armada was destroyed. 400 ships reduced to nothing. by a species that should have lost in the first hour. The bridge of the relentless dawn was silent. Captain Simmons sat in her chair, covered in burns and blood, one arm hanging useless at her side. Danny was crying at his station, tears running down his face. Maria's voice came through the speakers, weak but alive, reporting that the engines were holding dot. Katie Marsh was missing 2 fingers on her left hand. She had lost them when a piece of shrapnel hit her cockpit. But she had flown for 3 more hours before landing, because her friends needed her dot. She found Zethral in the observation deck after the battle. The old alien was standing at the window, staring at the stars with all 4 of his eyes. "You understand now?" she asked softly. Zethral turned to look at her. She was broken and bruised and barely standing, but her eyes were still bright. That fire was still burning. "I thought I knew war," he said. "I studied it for 300 years. I watched species fight and die across the galaxy. But I never understood what it meant to refuse defeat. To keep fighting not because victory was possible, but because surrender was unthinkable." Katie nodded. "That's who we are. Your people should have lost today. By every calculation, every model, every prediction. The Kreth had overwhelming force. You had nothing. We had each other." She looked out the window at the scattered remains of both fleets. "We had 10,000 years of learning that the universe doesn't care about us, that no one is coming to save us, that the only thing standing between us and extinction is our own stubborn refusal to accept it." Zethral was quiet for a long moment. "I will tell the Grand Council what I witnessed," he said finally. "They need to understand what humanity is, what you are capable of, what happens when you are pushed beyond all reasonable limits." "What will you tell them?" The old alien turned back to the stars. "I will tell them that humanity does not win because they are stronger or smarter or more numerous. You win because you have spent your entire existence learning that survival is a choice you make over and over, in the face of every horror the universe can create." He looked at Katie with something like respect in his ancient eyes. "I will tell them that when everything that could break you tried, you simply refused to be broken." Katie smiled. With her missing fingers and her bruised face and her exhausted body, she smiled. "That's who we are," she said. "That's who we've always been." Zethral nodded slowly. "And that," he said, "is what makes you terrifying." He returned to his quarters and began writing his final report. It took him many hours, many attempts, but in the end, he found the words he needed. "I have witnessed war for 3 centuries. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have recorded the deaths of billions and the birth of new civilizations. But I have never seen anything like humanity. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the oldest or the wisest. They are small and fragile and terribly, beautifully mortal, but they carry within them something that no other species possesses. A fire that burns in spite of the darkness. A will that bends but never breaks. A determination forged in 10,000 years of suffering and survival. I came to study them. I stayed to witness something impossible. And now I understand what makes them different from everyone else. When humanity is pushed to the edge, when all hope is lost and every logical path leads to defeat, they do not surrender. They do not retreat. They simply refuse to accept that the universe has the right to destroy them. They become unbound dot, and in that moment, they are the most dangerous force in existence. The galaxy should take notice. Humanity is awake. Humanity is angry. And humanity will never, ever give up. Zethral sealed the report and sent it to the Grand Council. Then he looked out his window at the stars and waited to see what humanity would do. Next, he had a feeling the universe was about to find out.